Recently, I read a report that I think is important for putting uh, not only our overall federal budget, federal policies into perspective, but recent events as well. It's a report from the National Priorities Project, and joining us now is its program director, Lindsay, now, because I've been so careful to pronounce it right, I'll pronounce it wrong, Koshgarian. Lindsay, did I get it right, first of all?
Yes, you got it just right.
Okay, Lindsay Koshgarian is as I say, the program director of the National Priorities Project. They recently released a report on April 17th that I guess recognizing the fact that April 15th was tax day for most of us, and it's a tax receipt, particularly how in the average American household's tax bill, how the military stacks up against some of the other things that go into our federal tax dollars. So, first of all, as I say, Lindsay, welcome to the program. And secondly, before we get into details of the report, this past weekend we saw the Congress pass $95 billion dollars in foreign aid, primarily military aid. There was some 9 billion or so in there for unspecified humanitarian aid and some other things that basically are, I would say, military aid adjacent. But what was your reaction to that vote?
Very dismayed to see that vote for a couple of reasons. One is that it's a tremendous amount of money, $95 billion. And we're told over and over again why Congress says we can't afford domestic programs that we desperately need. One really good example of that right now is the child tax credit, which this is a credit that's given to families with children through the tax system. It was expanded during the pandemic, helping to cut child poverty almost in half. And that expansion ended. The credit has gone back down from where it was before, which means that millions of children were plunged back into poverty. And Congress has declined to renew that funding. So we're told all the time, with healthcare, with climate funds, with infrastructure, we're told we don't have enough money for this and that. Meanwhile, Congress is passing this $95 billion essentially for wars, for Ukraine and Israel, and a bit for Taiwan. So that's incredibly dismaying. And of course, it's also incredibly dismaying because of the chunk of that funding that was for the Israeli military to continue their offensive assault on Gaza, where more than 30,000 people have died, a large number of those women and children. There is now an active famine that's taking hold in Gaza, and the Israeli military has certainly not abided by the laws of war in that assault, and Congress is just passing funding for it, which is against international law and against our own U.S. laws, and of course, offensive to our morals.
Absolutely correct on all accounts. My understanding, first of all, there's the so-called Ley Law that prohibits rather the United States from giving military aid to countries that are engaged in war crimes and other moral misdeeds and crimes. We have that paired with this massive amount of money, billions of dollars for Israel, paired with the International Court of Justice finding of the likelihood of genocide being committed, and that was some months ago. So there's even more overwhelming evidence now. 1.1 billion, according to the World Food Program at the UN, 1.1 million people now are in a state of famine, are in a famine situation. So we have those two events uh, already breaking internet, and it is illegal to aid and abet, as I understand it, to aid and abet war crimes, including genocide. So that places not only the United States, but the officials involved, and as I understand, according to the Center for Constitutional Rights, also places the members of Congress in legal jeopardy for supporting the aiding and abetting of a war crime. Do I have that wrong?
No, that's all consistent with my understanding also. Of course, the International Court of Justice hasn't yet determined this to be a genocide, but
Right.
they did say that it's plausibly genocide, and there's a responsibility by all parties, not just the Israeli government or the Israeli military, but the US government and all governments to prevent genocide. So there is a definite real possibility that that members of Congress and members of the administration who supported this policy could be found to have violated international law. And regardless, it's just atrocious what is happening on the ground in Gaza, the things that people there have had to put up with, the complete lack of any boundaries or any respect for civilian lives. By the Israeli military has just been horrific to watch, and the famine is a great example of that. We also have domestic laws saying that the US can't give military aid to any country that is actively blocking US humanitarian aid, and that is exactly the situation that's happening in Gaza right now, where the Israeli military is preventing the delivery of humanitarian aid that is supported by US funds.
And Americans, among people of other nationalities, have been killed uh, providing humanitarian aid. Uh, American journalists have been killed well before October 9th. There are a number of killings of journalists, including Shireen Abu Akleh, who is dual citizenship, I believe, was dual citizenship, but American citizen, a journalist, killed, clearly delineated as a journalist when she was shot. So yes, there's quite a bit to be concerned about. And overall, we have an economy that is, in my view anyway, being eaten alive by military spending. And I thought your tax receipt project that you folks did was very effective at conveying that. So maybe if you don't mind just telling us a little bit about uh, how it was done, and then we can go over a little bit of what you found.
Yes, so this is something we do every year. We release a tax receipt because while most people may file their taxes, they know whether they got a refund or not. They don't necessarily know what those tax dollars are actually going toward or supporting. And it's everything from programs like food stamps or SNAP, which was used by 1 in 10 Americans in recent years to afford to feed themselves. 1 in 10, that's a huge number of us. It's everything from that to the military and militarism and these wars and the funding for the Israeli military that we just talked about and all of those things. So we want people to have a sense of where those tax dollars are going, how these different priorities fit in. Um, and it's more of a sense that people can understand, right? If you hear federal budget numbers in typical reporting in the news, you'll hear dollars in the trillions or billions. It's not something that most of us can wrap our heads around,
Right.
a billion or 100 billion in the federal budget. What is that? It's something that's hard for people to understand. So with the tax receipt, our goal is to really say, okay, this is how much an average taxpayer is paying. These are figures that you can understand in terms of your own budget and in terms of what's expensive to you and what your priorities are. So that's what we do with the tax receipt. And we do that by looking at what federal income taxes pay for. So there are programs like Social Security in the federal government that are paid for by trust funds. That's not a part of this.
Okay, so setting that aside, that's a payroll tax, for example. So that would be, that feeds a trust fund. So you put that aside in your exercise. So did you take the average household income and then use that to divide the total expenditures in these different areas? I'm just trying, in terms of
Yeah,
methodology.
that,
Yeah,
that certainly would be one way to do it. The way that we actually do it is we take IRS data and we find the average total income tax paid in the United States, and that's about $19,000. And it's average. So actually, most people are paying a bit less than that because Some
There's
people with
some very
very
high
high
ones,
incomes
right?
pay a
Yeah,
lot more,
yeah,
and people with very low incomes frequently don't pay anything. So,
right.
but the average is $19,000. So we take that, and then we take all of the federal government expenses that have to be paid for by these income taxes. And then we just take a share of your income taxes. So, if all of the federal government expenses that are have to be paid for out of this pot, if something is 20% of that, then 20% of your income tax is paying for
Right.
that. That's how we do it.
So if one budget item in the federal budget is 10% of the total budget, and you're using an average number of 19,000, then that's $1,900.
That's right. Yes.
Right. Okay. So you've been doing this for years, so maybe it's not a surprising exercise to you anymore. Some of what you found were surprising to me. Uh, what do you think people would be most surprised about in this exercise?
Well, what we want what we want people to notice is how much of their dollars are going toward war and the Pentagon and militarism, and what a big chunk of money it is for the average household. So we found this year that over $5,000 of the average taxpayers that 19,000 is going to militarism and its support systems. So to us, that means the Pentagon and war. It means nuclear weapons, which are part of the Department of Energy. It means Pentagon contractors, and I'll come back to that because that's a big part of the takeaway for us. It means deportations and detentions and border militarization through the Department of Homeland Security. It means some federal law enforcement, mass incarceration at the federal level. And it also means veterans care, because even though we don't want to see less veterans care, that is part of the support system for our military and for the wars that we have now and that we've had over the last, 50 plus years for, as long as veterans live, they're in these systems. So it includes all of that. And then we take a particular look, because we know, for example, that a lot of corporations are not paying their fair share in taxes to uphold the cost of the federal government. We know that the share of income tax that corporations paid has gone way down from where it was over 40% of income taxes were paid by corporations in the mid 20th century to now it's under 10%
Right.
of income taxes that corporations are paying. And we know that there are profitable corporations that have paid $0 in federal income taxes, dozens of them. So we know that they're not paying their fair share, but we also know that the average taxpayer is actually directly subsidizing many of those corporations. And because the Pentagon is the biggest contracting agency in the federal government by far, that means that the average taxpayer gave over $1,700 in 2023 to the Pentagon's corporate contractors. And that's more than the average month's rent in this country.
So you have, and that's a striking figure. Now, it just maybe as a little bit of an aside, you may have run across the criticism from, for example, modern monetary theory people that taxes are not actually what's used to governments create the money when they spend it and that sort of thing. I'm very familiar with those arguments. Perhaps you are too, and that theory, and I see a lot of merit in it. But I still think, so I guess two-part question or question and comment. First, I still think there's great value in this, regardless of your feelings about the theory of finance, because it makes it personal and concrete in that sense. Two, I think it's also sort of using the right wing's tactics against them. They tend to project these things out 100 years and then say some benevolent small social program will cost $1 gazillion or something. Uh, so this is kind of using that information correctly rather than to terrify. But I guess, have you faced these kinds of criticisms, and what kinds of criticisms have you faced, and what are your responses?
Yeah, I have, I have faced these questions slash criticisms. Modern monetary theory, I think, can be useful in that it can point out that debt is not necessarily a bad
Right,
thing or something we should be worried about.
right,
Which is something I fully agree with, that there are absolutely appropriate times to take on debt, and that it's probably a lot more than typical economists would, or certainly our typical politics would lead us to believe, where, we have folks in this country who want to see the United States federal government run a balanced budget, and there is just absolutely no justification or need for that. So I
right.
think there is some real value to that. What I would come back with here is to say that the federal government does spend money, regardless of where it comes from. So there's sort of, where does it come from and where does it go? And the federal government is spending money, and that money is enacting real things in the world, right?
Right,
There is a
right.
food stamps program, there is a military, we have 750 military installations around the world. All of these things have real manifestations that don't care where the money came from. And so part of what we're trying to get people to think about is, what is the balance of those activities of our government? Is our government engaged in feeding people and making sure people are housed and making sure people have health care
Right.
and making sure we have clean air and water? Or is our government engaged in building fences and borders and deporting people and engaging in wars and supporting conflicts um, and dominating the world militarily? And where do you want our government to be engaged?
And
So
that's
that's what I think is
exactly,
the real value of this, is that it shows people that balance of priorities.
yeah, I think that's exactly right. And let's go through some of these numbers, Lindsay. We've got, for example, that the average taxpayer paid $1,087 for Pentagon contractors. What about the military overall? How much did they spend?
So the military, there are different ways of sort of defining it. If you look at just the Pentagon, it's just short of $3,000
Hmm.
that the average taxpayer gave. But typically, um, the military actually includes, like I mentioned earlier, nuclear weapons are actually part of the Department of Energy. And so there are other
Right.
things that are clearly military but aren't part of the Pentagon. And all told, that adds up to about $3,700 for the average taxpayer.
Right. That's a lot. The average taxpayer, your report says, paid $74 for nuclear weaponry and just $43 for the CDC. And this is after, by the way, more than 1 million Americans died in a pandemic. It just astonishes me that pandemic response is barely on the list.
Yes.
Right? And more than 1,000 just for Pentagon contractors, roughly $300 for the top five military versus $19 for mental health and substance abuse programs, $106 from, like they used to say, from our family to yours, from my family to Lockheed Martin's family, and only $6 for renewable energy.
Yeah,
Uh,
actually, I think you might be looking at at last year's version, which I'll try
Oh,
to.
you're right. Actually, I am. I apologize for that. So let
So
me see.
many of those numbers have gone up, but they've all gone up.
I doubt
Um,
they've gone. Many of the military numbers have gone down. I don't see
no,
how
they
that.
certainly haven't. The military spending has gone up tremendously. It's been going up for years, and it's actually now at the highest level since World War One, World War Two. Um, And so, yes, so all of those numbers have gone up, but the military numbers are significantly higher than they have been in the past. But the point stands. Um, Climate change is arguably the biggest threat to humanity that we face right now, internationally and domestically. We have, floods and wildfires and all kinds of things that people are dealing with. And the average taxpayer is paid last year $10.84 for renewable energy and energy efficiency. And that's just, I mean, that's incomprehensible, really. Given that, we're spending, they spend $3,700 for the military and only less than $11 on renewable energy and energy efficiency. And this is, after the landmark Inflation Reduction Act, that's the biggest piece of legislation ever to pass Congress to combat climate change. A lot of those is tax credits, which doesn't show up here, but the point stands that we're not investing in so many of these other things. The
Right.
substance abuse and mental health programs now are at less than $32 per taxpayer. And we're still in the midst of an opioid crisis. We still have a very high level of deaths from
Right.
opioid use in this country right now. And insufficient programs, people who are struggling with opioid use disorders are frequently left without help. There aren't enough programs, there aren't enough spaces. Anyone who's had a family member struggle with that knows the reality of that. And there are just things like that where such a small investment compared to the military budget would make a huge, tremendous difference in people's lives, and we're not making those investments.
Right, right. And you mentioned, so these are 2023 figures I'm looking at now. I finally got the right one. And by the way, it could be found at nationalpriorities.org. Uh, but so these are 2023. We already know that the military budget, even before last weekend, had been increased going into 2024. Now, do you have a sense, once there is one full year, or any way you can slice it, do you have a sense of the sort of per household cost of the $95 billion that was just passed?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's hard to predict next year's numbers because, something goes up, something else goes down, both numbers change.
Right.
It's very hard to predict, but military spending is going up. There's no question about it. The big questions are, will there be any kind of resolution in the Ukraine war, and will there be a resolution in Gaza that affect some of that spending next year? But even if that were to magically happen this year, the US military budget is already well over $800 billion a year. And that's
Right.
even before you add in this money for Ukraine and Israel. So we're already seeing that budget get closer and closer. It's speeding towards $1 trillion. So we're just going to see these numbers get higher, and we're just going to see that they're taking up a bigger portion of the budget overall. And so we've taken actually a longer view of this and looked back in the 20 years after 9/11, when the US had wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the full range of response, the Department of Homeland Security was created, all of that. During those 20 years, the US added $2 on military and related spending for every dollar that we added on domestic spending. So the
Which is
military budget
astonishing.
is growing by leaps and bounds, and that trend
Right.
has not stopped.
Right. And you don't have to authorize this in your official role, but just sort of very, very like ad hoc, right? $95 billion. Let's say 80 billion of it is direct military spending. That's low, but let's be conservative. Against an $800 billion budget is roughly a 10% add-on. If the direct military budget last year was 3,700, is that what you said it was? uh, Roughly
Yes.
33,700 for the Pentagon, then it's about at least $370 a household that they just spent, 1 year's worth. Of that, you could triple the child tax credit, for example, and have money left over with that money. You could add 60% to the food stamp budget. You could double the budget for K-12 education. I mean, I could go on. You could
Yeah.
multiply the substance abuse and mental health budget 15 times. So it strikes me that the cavalier way in which the media, for example, as well as the political world, addresses expenditure of this magnitude when it comes to the military, as against, can you imagine if somebody proposed, a president or a senator, proposed tripling the child tax credit? There would be expressions of horror across the country, and Jamie Dimon and other bank presidents would howl in outrage, and so would the so-called neutral news reporters say this is irresponsible and adding to the deficit. But you do that on a military level, and Okay, it finally passed. That's the nature of the coverage.
Right. There's
Am
an
I
absolute
wrong?
double standard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, what other things should people perhaps know about uh, what you found with the 2023 taxes and what we might be able to expect with 2024's taxes?
I mean, another thing that we point out a lot is that more than half typically of the Pentagon's budget goes to contractors. So, these corporations, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, others that are profiting from the US having a worldwide military presence and engaging in these conflicts and selling or gifting weapons to other countries. All of those are profit interests, right, for these corporations. And so we want people to know how much they're giving to those corporations. And so I talked about the total $1,700 for Pentagon contractors. But another example of that is the average taxpayer gave $87 to Boeing last year for Pentagon contracts. And Boeing, of course, has had tremendous problems on their commercial flight side. They've had planes crashing, they've had planes falling apart in midair. They've had whistleblowers telling stories of, contractors jumping on plane parts to get them to fit together in order to build their commercial planes. Just terrible stuff. And, meanwhile, the budget, the average taxpayer is only giving to the Federal Aviation Administration, the agency that's responsible for regulating commercial airline safety, only gets $23. So almost four times as much for Boeing for their Pentagon contracts, and which also are problematic. There's lots of price gouging. There's lots of other things happening on the Pentagon side, but Boeing is getting this much from the federal government for its Pentagon work, and the agency that's supposed to regulate it and make sure that we can be safe when we fly commercially is getting so much less. So, the sort of, you can see that the corporations are working the system and that they're benefiting from it very handsomely.
Right. And, personally, I think that any corporation that gets federal money like that should be banned from lobbying. That they, because they're, of course, distorting horrifically our policies in order to suit their bottom line at the expense of the rest of us. But before I let you go, Lindsay, what else is the National Priorities Project working on that people should know about?
Yeah, so we are always watching federal budget developments, so very closely watching the 95 billion package that just passed through Congress and have commentary on that, and we'll have some writing coming out on that in the next days. We have at our website, nationalpriorities.org, a budget calculator tool that people can use. It's interactive, and you can pick which federal program you want to defund, or at least see what that money would be capable of. And then it'll tell you, how many teachers we could hire or how many houses we could power through solar electricity or other things that you may think are better investments. So we always have that available for folks, and it's fun because you can actually customize it for your own city or town, and really get a sense of kind of what that difference might mean in your own community.